Sallie Bingham is a true national treasure. As founder of the Kentucky Foundation for Women, she has ensured the development of countless Kentucky artists who might never have found the means to pursue their gifts. As benefactor of the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke, she helps preserve the words and art of women, making them accessible to scholars and artists. And as director of the National Book Critics Circle, she has been part of helping to celebrate the nation's best literature and bring it into the public eye. And these are only her most visible activities. Then there is her writing. Provocative, wise, nurturing, challenging, and enlarging her readers. That little girl, who had been writing literally since she was able to write, wrote short stories and novels that from the first took their readers by storm. Her early honors included the Dana Reed Prize at Harvard for Best Undergraduate Writing and a stint as editor of Mademoiselle. Houghton Mifflin published her first novel, After Such Knowledge, in 1961. It was quickly followed by her first collection of short stories, which she says were mostly about loneliness, the loneliness that was my companion as well as my complaint for so many years. The collection, heralded for its unblinking gaze, was the first of 5 she has published now. She's also published 3 collections of poetry, 6 novels, and a memoir. She's written plays and seen them staged, and with 2 friends, being Sallie, not content to have her own work produced, she founded the Women's Project and Productions in New York to give women's plays a chance to be produced. All the while, she has never stopped pushing herself to discover what writing might lie ahead for her, or apparently ever doubted her ability to produce it, despite the turmoil of a life as a private and sometimes unwillingly public woman, mother to 3 sons and now grandmother to 5 children. To list her achievements so fluidly is to overlook the hard, invisible work that went into finding and claiming her place as a writer, a work to which she has remained dedicated. Thank goodness for all of us. She not only persevered for herself, but turned a compassionate gaze on other women artists whose struggle she understood to her core. Her publications and awards are numerous. Her short fiction has been included in Best American Short Stories, 40 Best Stories from Mademoiselle, Prize Story, the O. Henry Awards, and the Harvard Advocate Centennial Anthology. In addition, she's received numerous fellowships. Of the new and selected stories gathered in Mending, Publishers Weekly says, Bingham's work remains sharp and deliciously unsettling, ripe for discovery by a new generation of readers. I am proud and grateful to be able to present to you one of Kentucky's true treasures, Sallie Bingham.
After that, I really don't need to say anything, do I? This collection, it's Saraband Books, which I know some of you know is another Kentucky treasure, wonderful independent publisher in Louisville, is called Mending after the title story. And I realized after I chose the title that nobody understands that word. When I say mending, people think I say minding or something else. But it's mending, M-E-N-D-I-N-G, because it's about the mending of the title character, something she does for herself. It isn't done for her. That story is too long to read tonight. I'm going to read a story from a slightly earlier collection. That collection was called Red Car. I like the color red. If I can possibly work it in, I do. And this story, I think, is emblematic of what continues to be my main fascination with writing, both my own writing and other people's, which is mystery. Those things that can never be explained and probably can't even be adequately described. Red car. Car may not be the word. Automobile is long outdated, and car seems to be going or to have already gone the same way. although it is perhaps still appropriate for this particular vehicle, a red '59 Cadillac convertible with a front seat wider than a porch swing, a cumbersome white top, and the makings of history in its various grills, bumpers, fins, and chrome ornaments. To tell the story of this car is to tell the story of marriage. Not their marriage, not the marriage, but marriage as it generally happens, a state, a place, a condition that gives rise to certain thoughts and attitudes, certain conclusions. Marriage equals the red car. March, the red car has been parked for a year in front of a pretty frame house in Florida. It sits at the curb like a claim, loud and clear to the pretty frame house, an exclamation point in that quiet neighborhood. The wife rode in the car for the last time in March. She had eaten dinner with her husband in a restaurant they visited on their way to the airport and on the way back to the airport, and often in between, a lively little place with a bar overlooking the ocean. They both dreaded going back to the house. There's a silence particular to the end of a marriage when there are no words, not even any actions to convey the despair, the listlessness of the approaching end. And the broad white bed in the big bedroom is no longer even a hope or a possibility, but another item on an endless list of disappointments and regrets. So when he said, "Shall we take a drive?" she thought it was a good idea to put off that end. They drove out along the bay where the houseboats are snubbed up against the highway and the lights from the strip developments waver in oily darkness. He pulled her in under his arm and drove with his left hand, and she wondered why once again she was allowing him to drive her when he was drunk, and why once again their past seemed to have returned. The one-handed driver, the broad seat, the woman shivering in a light cotton dress under the heavy arm of a man to whom she appears, against all reason, to belong. They stopped to look out over the water for a while, as a few months later they would stop in an overgrown field to look for the last time at a pair of circling hawks. The power that held them in the palm of its hand arranged these last times carefully. The beautiful golden field leading to massed sycamores at the edge of the creek, the beautiful expanse of the Atlantic at the edge of the built-up town. Last times have a certain weight, a smallness and density. They stay in memory like pebbles at the bottom of a child's pail. Driving back, she remembered the way the red car had come into their lives. A son, turning 16, bought it for $500. The car barely moved, but the body was beautiful, and the design recalled a vanished, elegant life. This son spent a desultory summer poking around under the hood with the help of a wisecracking handyman who knew something about motors. But the process was slow, and before long the handyman had taken over. He knew what to do, and he worked in the cool early morning before the young owner was stirring. So, by the end of that summer, the car was running, but it no longer belonged to the boy who had paid $500 for it. It belonged to the handyman's master, who had paid for parts and labor and who now had the car repainted a brilliant carmine red. The boy did not protest when his stepfather took the car. After all, he had paid for the parts and the labor. The handyman drove the car down to Florida that winter and parked it in front of the pretty frame house. As the marriage began to slide, the family seldom went to Florida. The trip was expensive in more ways than one, and no one hoped any longer to be able to enjoy spending time together. A few incidents had ended all expectation of that, substituting a brittle atmosphere where no one laughed or cried. So the red car gathered dust and leaves outside of the pretty frame house. Passers-by sometimes noticed it and wondered about its history. In June, the handyman's master, the husband and stepfather of the family, began to come down to Florida alone. He enjoyed driving the red car to restaurants, and when he met people there, he drove the car to their apartments. He liked to take the car that had been his stepson's, but not really, and in which his wife had sat silent under the weight of his arm, to little spots in Old Town, little apartments above bars, respites and hideaways where the young women who worked the bars and restaurants lived with their clutter of makeup bottles, their fleets of sandals, their blue jeans patched and faded, their collections of T-shirts, and here and there a snapshot of a mother back at home in Indiana. Soon, one of these young women laid claim to the red car. She had been taken to restaurants in it, and she'd put her comb in the glove compartment and her feet up on the seat as she curled in under the driver's arm. She felt sorry for him, another 40-ish married man who groaned when she stroked him, and she liked the car. And so one Sunday night when she drove him to the airport, she asked for the keys, and he gave them to her. Now she drove herself to work, parking the red car outside the clothing store where she was about to become assistant manager. It was hardly fitting for an assistant manager of a store that had outlets in Miami and Fort Lauderdale to come and go on a battered Schwinn. After that, the husband let the girl know what flight to meet on Fridays, and she was always there, freshly showered in a clean T-shirt and shorts. It seemed a paradise to both of them. The pretty frame house, paid for by the wife, who never came to Florida anymore. The pretty red car, which everyone noticed and admired, and which had belonged to the stepson, but not really. And the picture they made in it, the handsome 40-ish husband and the girl who was assistant manager and knew her worst days were over. The car seemed to lengthen. It seemed to take up more space at the curb. Then one night, there was trouble for the husband back east, and two men came down to Florida and began in an unobtrusive way to look for the red car. They were skillful professionals, and no one would have noticed them except that their clothes were dark. They did buy themselves last plain out of Key West T-shirts, but that did not blunt the edge of strangeness that made people look at them twice. They went first to the pretty frame house. The car was not there, and the young woman, who by now was living in the house, did not appear to be there either. They discovered the car parked in the bushes at the airport. They looked it over carefully and found a comb in the glove compartment. Late one night, they watched the young woman step off the Miami puddle jumper and walk to the red car. She had a little suitcase that she threw into the back seat, and then she released the chrome hooks that held the top in place with which the wife, who never came to Florida anymore, had often struggled, and pushed the top back. She pulled the car out of the bushes and started down the highway, going at a good pace, and the two professionals drove along behind her. First, she stopped at a large, expensive house and knocked on the front door. A Cuban woman, or so the professionals dubbed her, came out with a small child. All three got in the red car and drove rapidly to a pet store, which, since it was night, was closed. However, someone was waiting inside, behind the bubbling fish tanks and the parrots on swings, and the three went in, emerging a few minutes later. They drove to another pet store on the other side of town and repeated the sequence. Then the young woman took the older woman and her child, if it was her child, the professionals couldn't tell, although she seemed protective of the little boy, holding him by the hand, back to the expensive house. Next, the young woman drove to an old house that was broken up into many small apartments. After she had been inside for a few minutes, a fancy foreign car drove up. The driver hopped out, went inside briefly, and came out again. That was all that happened. Something had been claimed, exchanged, or given away. Certainly, the professionals knew money had been involved, but they couldn't find a reason to ask questions. Young women do come and go. The red car, which had belonged to the 16-year-old boy, which had passed through the hands of the wisecracking handyman on its way to the 40-ish husband who was about to become single again, and in which he had driven his wife for the last time, was parked outside of an old house broken up into many apartments, where young women kept their clutter of makeup bottles, their fleets of sandals, their collections of T-shirts, and here and there a snapshot of a mother at home in Indiana. Did it all begin with the boy's silence when the car, as was only just, passed out of his hands? Or with the handyman's silence when the car, which he had fixed, passed along to the owner? Or with the silence of the wife when she sat under the weight of her husband's arm? Or is there another silence, the silence of night ocean and south wind, combing the darkness while these sleepers lie under the secret verdict of the future? Thank you.